1 year ago today, the Center for Disease Control reported that the novel coronavirus had made its way into the United States. 14 cases had been identified. Now, a year later, we've all been affected by the pandemic. It's caused massive disruption to our day-to-day lives. We know that over 2 million people have lost their lives, and of course, many more have lost loved ones. But it's not just that. We also have economies that have been disrupted, and many people have been threatened with poverty. And it's estimated that it will take a very long time to overcome the social and political consequences of what has happened. And of course, the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable in our society has uncovered fault lines of long-standing inequities. Suffering has touched all of our lives. But the good news is that we are not left to cope with our suffering alone. We have a God who invites us to bring our suffering to Him, to cast our burdens on Him because He cares for us. And we have a model for how to do this in the form of lament. Like other Christian practices such as fasting or meditation on Scripture and communion, lament is a spiritual discipline because its regular practice shapes us in the developmental pathways of our faith. Specifically, lament is a powerful discipline for embedding us firmly in the Christian story, helping us to find meaning in our suffering. But what is lament? A quick search in dictionaries reveals definitions. For example, lament is to express sorrow, regret, or unhappiness about something. Or lament is a formal expression of sorrow or mourning, especially in verse or song. But biblical lament is much more than this. It's not just an expression of deep emotion, it's an expression to a specific person, to God. It's not just a formal expression of sorrow, but it also calls out to God for action. And finally, biblical lament has this surprising element that radically differs from more secular versions of lament. It ends in sometimes exuberant praise to God. Lament is found throughout the Old Testament, perhaps most clearly in the Psalms, where it's estimated that up to 40% of them are laments. And these passages of lament are quoted extensively in the New Testament. As a practicing Jew, Jesus would have participated in the communal praying and singing of the Psalms, including the Psalms of Lament. And so these formed the backdrop for his own personal practice of lament. Jesus consistently brought his suffering before God. Hebrews 5:7 says, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death." When Jesus was faced with the suffering of others, as when Lazarus died, he lamented. When faced with his upcoming death in the Garden of Gethsemane, he lamented. Even on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting from Psalm 22, which is, guess what? A psalm of lament. And shortly after, Jesus quotes from yet another psalm of lament, Psalm 31, crying out, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," before dying. So when we follow Jesus' example in responding to suffering, we find at our disposal the resources that Jesus himself drew on, including lament. But why is lament such a powerful spiritual discipline for those going through times of suffering? Well, suffering is disorienting. It shakes up our assumptions about the world and our place in it, about the way that things should be. So, for example, as a lifelong Christian, I believe in a God who's love. It's an important part of my worldview. So in December of 2013, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. My initial understanding of my cancer as a threat to my life and a potential tragedy to my husband and sons was incompatible with my view of God as a loving God. From my perspective, my cancer was not the way that things should be in a world governed by a loving God. How could this be? So in addition to the emotional reactions to the cancer diagnosis itself, I had to struggle with a world in which my sense of meaning had suffered a severe blow. Suffering does this. It undermines our sense of stability in the world, our framework for understanding reality. This is where lament comes in. In praying through the lament, the structure of the lament begins to restore some sense of order in the midst of chaos. It moves us from disorientation to a new orientation. It helps us to find words to express the experience of suffering. And putting words to our suffering helps us to bring our experiences into the relationship with God, allowing us to be molded by our encounter with God and with God's character. When we express our suffering in the form of lament, when we allow our experiences to be shaped by the words of lament, our experiences themselves are transformed. So in the remainder of our time together today, I'd like to briefly walk you through this structure of lament as a way of teaching you to do lament on your own. The Psalms of Lament typically begin by crying out to God. Psalm 13, for example, which I'll be using here, is, "How long, Lord?" Lament is by definition engagement with God. The whole purpose of lament is to bring our suffering to God. So lament is not lonely catharsis. It's not merely the expression of our feelings. It's also not grumbling to others behind God's back, as the Israelites did in the desert. So one crucial element in biblical lament has to do with the fact that we can bring all of our experiences, including our suffering, to God. Now, from a relational perspective, this is really crucial. In bringing the suffering to God, we can take initiative in the relationship with God and be responded to by God. The situation could very well be different. We've all been in relationships where we really didn't matter that much, maybe in relationship to a professor or to a boss. The other person called all the shots in the relationship. We simply responded. There was no room in the relationship for our own perspectives or concerns or needs. We had no confidence that attempts to bring those things into the relationship would result in them being attended to or responded to by the other person. Now, this kind of a relationship does not allow for any kind of intimacy, because intimacy requires responsiveness. Our relationship with God could very well take this form. After all, God is this all-powerful, omniscient being, right? Our interactions with God could be limited to us simply responding to God, to God's greatness in worship, instead of also being responded to by God. But our God is not that kind of a God. Our God is one who invites expression of our concerns and our needs, and then responds to them in the way that an attuned mother responds to her child. In the second component of lament, the cause of the suffering is brought before God in complaint. For example, Psalm 13 says, "Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" While Psalm 13 speaks of enemies, there's actually a wide array of causes of suffering represented in the Psalms of Lament. There's a Psalm of Lament for almost every occasion. These include bodies that aren't working well, disease and pain, disappointments in life, depression, and people who have disappointed us. But the most startling thing about the complaint is that God himself is often the focus of the complaint. In Psalm 13, the psalmist accuses God of forgetting him and hiding from him. These complaints against God in lament often take the form of two fundamental questions. God, where are you? And God, if you love me, then why? It seems as if nothing is off limits when it comes to expressing our suffering to God. Doubts about God, anger at God. God is open to us expressing honestly whatever is in our hearts. Again, this is remarkable. In our other relationships, our honesty is often bounded by things like power differentials in the relationship, or concern for the well-being of others, or fear of the reactions of others. God alone is big enough to deal in absolute honesty with whatever is in our hearts. This complaining to God is important because research suggests that processing our suffering cognitively and emotionally is important for growth to emerge through our suffering. The time that we spend sitting in our suffering is crucial. In fact, some psychological studies suggest that the amount of growth we experience is directly related to the amount of intentional engagement with our suffering. Now, while avoiding our suffering is not particularly helpful, neither is it helpful to get stuck in it. And in the third element of lament, the request, God is acknowledged as the one who can actually do something about our suffering. In Psalm 13, for example, the request is, "Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes." The psalmist knows what he wants, and he asks God for it. He wants to know that God sees him and responds to him. When we bring our request to God, we are acknowledging that God does have the power to change our circumstances. And as we acknowledge that reality, it brings us hope. When we ask God to act, we are reminded that God can act to change situations, that God has acted in the past on our behalf. Hope is absolutely essential for helping us to regain our sense of meaning, of balance when we're going through a tough time. Study after study in the psychological literature shows that hope is central to feeling that life has meaning and to a sense of flourishing in life. Now, when psychologists study hope, they study a psychological construct that's rather vague, kind of like a sense of optimism about the future. But when we Christians talk about hope, we're talking about a very specific meaning, one that puts suffering in the context of God making everything whole, including ourselves, at the end of time. For example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says, "Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." The particular content of hope from a Christian perspective is important because faith does not pit our current suffering against the end times, the glory that is to come. If it did, then our faith would be a faith that silences the suffering by simply distracting us from our current circumstances. It would be, as Mark said, an opiate for the masses. But our hope does not diminish the difficult events in our life, telling us that our suffering is not important or suggesting that it doesn't exist in some way. Instead, what our hope does is it reminds us that we live in a transitional age, that our current suffering is temporary, but our future hope is eternal. Christ has defeated suffering and death, but we're still living in anticipation of the end of the story. And so in the meanwhile, we still need lament in our hope. Using the language of Romans 8, we still groan as we wait. Our suffering doesn't disappear, but it is put in a different context. Not the context of our current life and hopes and dreams, but the much larger, glorious, to use the biblical language, reality of our future hope. And this context can make all the difference. The last component of lament, found in all but one of the Psalms of Lament, is the expression of confidence in God. The transition to praise and worship is completed with this component. This transition is often marked by that little word, but. It signals a contrast, a movement into a new way of experiencing reality. It signals a line that is crossed in which the focus shifts from one centered on the psalmist and his own pain to one centered on God. The transition can seem sometimes quite abrupt. It can be quite startling. For example, Psalm 13 ends, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." What causes this transition to praise? this actually isn't clear in the Psalms. The Psalms of Lament are silent regarding why or how this shift to praise has occurred. Has God already acted? Maybe. But my own sense is that something else happens here. There's a shift that is internal rather than external, that is based on psychological and spiritual shifts rather than a change in our external circumstances. I think that this transition occurs because of the surrender to God that the earlier components of lament facilitate. Even when God has not yet acted, the movement through the lament leads us to a place of worship, of surrender. As we pray through the Psalms, as we call out to God, as we bring our complaints and our hearts and our petitions to God, as we allow ourselves to be reminded of who God is, our experiences themselves are transformed. Now, it's clear that suffering just by itself does not necessarily lead to praise. We all know people who have faced suffering and have emerged bitter and even alienated from God. So what is it about engaging with our suffering in lament before God that leads to the kind of intimacy with God that results in praise and worship? I think it does boil down to this one thing, to surrender. In our everyday lives, we may acknowledge who we are in relationship to God. We may even intentionally cultivate attitudes of humility before God. But like Job, we are never entirely stripped of our claim on autonomy, self-determination, and control of our lives until we hit that wall of our utter helplessness in the face of what we so much most desperately desire. And if we're wise, this will lead us to acknowledge what has been true all along, that we are finite, created for a dependent relationship with a loving, omnipotent, omniscient God. When we are made to face this truth by our suffering, we can then lovingly enter into that relationship in the form of surrender. This year's chapel theme is instead. In Lament, God invites us to take a journey to praise instead of suffering, from meaning instead of meaninglessness, to a focus on God and God's loving plan for us instead of a focus on ourselves and our circumstances. So in wrapping up today, let me encourage you to take advantage of this spiritual discipline of lament. The way out of suffering is through it, not around it. And the Psalms of Lament offer us guidance down this difficult path.
So there's a lot to unpack. My first question is simply, Dr. Hall, how did you get interested in lament? You say your research is in meaning making and suffering. How did that all start?
Well, I mentioned during my talk that in December of 2013, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so really that's where it started. In terms of lament, what I found myself just doing is every morning for a big chunk of time, I would read something about cancer, or I would read my Bible, and I would just cry out to God. Often, I'd often spend a long period of time crying before God, just kind of wrestling with Him. And often I would end up going to the Psalms during those times. Now, I had never heard of lament, and in fact, it was after I was already out of treatment a couple of years later that a book by Todd Billings, Rejoicing Lament, came across my desk, and I thought, oh, this is what I was doing during that time. And so that led me into just investigating a little bit more thoroughly kind of what lament was from a biblical perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one thing that I really liked that you did was that you located Christian lament within popular understandings of complaint. I'd love for you to unpack that for us a little bit more. Like, what's the difference between a Christian lament versus popular complaint?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do just with that intentionality of bringing our suffering to God, right? When we complain, we typically don't even complain to the person that we should be complaining to. We typically complain behind people's backs, right? We complain to our friends, we complain. In this case, what we are intentionally doing is bringing our complaint to God. And so I think that makes all of the difference, because even if we are in a place of tension with God, which is often the case when we're lamenting, the very fact of our bringing it into that relationship suggests a certain attitude on our part in terms of the relationship with God.
Yeah. I love that relationality aspect of it. Well, if I'm at Starbucks though, and they get my drink wrong, and I'm realizing, wow, this Starbucks just sucks. Is that worthy enough for complaint or for Christian lament? Is that okay or?
It's something that I would mention to my husband, for example, right? And if you think about it that way, we have a God who cares about our experiences, right? So I don't know if it's particularly helpful to think about suffering as being tiny suffering or large suffering or, where we are on the spectrum. I think the point is that God is interested in our experiences, right?
Yeah.
And our experiences might be, in the big scheme of things, a little trivial. It might be that our irritation at the barista means that we are a little self-centered, right? That we don't care as much about others and their experiences as we should. Maybe he or she is having a bad day, right? But the point is not to judge our experiences. The point is to bring our experiences into relationship with God. Because that relationship with God is what is going to transform our experiences, right? If we are people who are self-centered and care only about our own immediate experiences, that pathway through lament that ends up in worship of God and recognizing who God is actually what's going to do the change in our perspective.
Yeah.
So I'd say bring it all to God.
Yeah. I love how you underhandedly said I was a jerk, but not a jerk at the same time. Right there. But one of the things though that you said that was really helpful for me as an Asian American person is that when we lament, we're actually initiating a relationship with God, and there's a power differential, but I have that opportunity to bring everything to Him. And again, in an Asian context, the elders they just have a little more power, and you don't bring everything to your elders. Man, that was so refreshing for me and so freeing. I'd love to hear more about what you think about how that unlocks a little bit more of a relationality with who God is.
Yeah. The relationship with God is so interesting from that perspective, right? Because, the power, you speak of power differential, it's so immense with respect to God that we can't even, kind of with our limited minds understand, the power differential, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, God presents Himself as being so with us, right?
Yeah.
So close to us.
Yeah.
And so I do think it's important that we are able to initiate in that relationship because even psychological understandings of intimacy require that the things that are of concern to us be shared with the people that we are intimate with.
Yeah.
And that they respond appropriately to that. And so in all kind of psychological theories of intimacy, that ability to share of oneself, of vulnerable feelings, for example, of things that we care about a lot, is just going to be foundational for the kind of close relationship that God invites us to. This makes sense if we think about, our romantic partner or a good friend. It just makes sense that we have to be vulnerable. We have to be able to bring things into that relationship in order for that intimacy to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You ended your talk with this idea of surrender and the importance of surrender. I'd love to hear more about that. Sometimes surrender feels like I'm detaching or I'm running away from something. I'd love to hear, what does it mean for me to surrender through the situation?
Yeah, surrender is a really tricky word. I think sometimes surrender brings with it the idea that we are just kind of passively giving up, right?
Yep.
And so there's a couple of things about the type of surrender that I'm talking about that are very different than that. So the first one is that the kind of surrender I'm talking about is very active. There's actually nothing passive about it, right? It's an act of continuing to engage, continuing to trust, right? It's kind of an ongoing cooperation with God and God's work in our lives, right? So it's active. The other thing is that it's loving. It's a response to God's love, and it's our kind of lovingly responding to God. And again, this is important because, when we think of surrender, one of the uses of the term is like an army surrendering to another army, right, when they've been defeated.
Right.
And this isn't kind of a loveless capitulation because we have no alternatives, right? Instead, it's a response to God's loving, invitation to us. And so then we can respond in kind with love.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks for clarifying that too. I think, you pointed out that 40% of the Psalms are laments, and there's laments throughout the Bible. Jesus lamented even on the cross. We don't talk about it too much in churches. Like, what's going on? Why do you think that is?
Culture shapes our expressions of our Christianity, right? And here in the United States, especially, we're a very upbeat culture, right? We're most comfortable with kind of that triumphant Christ resurrected. We, as a culture, have not actually gone through that much suffering compared to other places in the world where, just everyday life is difficult, and where they've endured things like, in Europe, the First and Second World Wars that have marked their culture. We haven't gone through that much of that, right? And so it's easy for us to marginalize suffering because suffering is not very comfortable. And so I think that is why lament has gone by the wayside. Why bring up a psalm that is kind of depressing in its focus, right, on enemies and suffering and that kind of thing, if we can do a psalm that is all about rejoicing, right?
Yeah.
And so we do that, I think, as a response to what we think is important in our culture. We're influenced by our cultural response to suffering in general.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. And thank you for inviting us into that clear picture of what a lament looks like, into a deeper relationship with God. So thank you for your time today.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.